So it is a great pleasure. Thank you, Bakhtior. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. And I would like now to get started with my presentation. So today I'm going to talk to you about East European big banks and East European migrations and the political economy of the United States. So with my PhD student and co-author Oliver Wach, we have been exploring how events, how important incidents in Eastern Europe have influenced the political landscape of America throughout the 20th century. So our idea relates very much to the fact that the United States, and this is actually connected to what we're observing in the recent weeks when it comes to the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, that the United States become oftentimes the mirror of what has already happened in Eastern Europe. So what happened in Eastern Europe in the beginning of the 20th century that should be important for the US? On the one hand, we have the Russian Revolution, the collapse of the Russian Empire, and the intensification of an already existing set of migration flows from the lands of the Russian Empire to the United States. On the other hand, we have the process of Polish state building, of Polish autonomy, of Polish self-determination. As we know, the Poles have been having a very powerful independence movement in the Russian Empire that also fed the rise of socialism. So the big question here is how these transnational migration processes impact political outcomes in the United States. Does the Polish migration predict the democratic vote? Does the Russian migration predict or has been conducive to the Republican vote in America? How is American political development being shaped by these two very powerful big banks? The transition of Russia from the empire to the Soviet Union and the process of creating an independent Polish state. So we start with a picture. So this is from a public repository. And what do you see here? Linia, Gdynia, America. Where is Gdynia? Who can tell me where is Gdynia? In Poland, where exactly? What is a famous city close to, maybe we don't know Gdynia so much, but we know a city that starts with the same letters that is next to Gdynia. Gdansk. Thank you very much, Oksana. So Gdynia is next to Gdansk, and it's a much bigger commercial port than Gdansk, or a comparable commercial port to Gdansk. So this is the line connecting Gdynia to America in the 1930s. And what is the motivation for this research? So migration has shaped political debates, campaigns, and election outcomes. Everybody is talking about migration these days. The Ukrainian migrants, the Ukrainian refugees in the European Union, actually we're still in the process in the EU to counting the Ukrainian refugees that have come from Ukraine since the last 3 years. Syrian refugees, so migrants that are work seekers that go from one region of the world to another to seek better economic conditions, even if they are not part of a conflict. So, and migration, as you know, I mean, the German election was a week ago almost, is also a very important political issue. Some parties that compete for legitimacy are in favor of migration because they think that is good for the economy. Some parties believe that migration is the source of unnecessary competition in the labor market, and it has also a strong cultural spillover that they don't like. But despite the fact that migration is so important for the modern world, we don't have a clear understanding still how migration and migrants influence political behavior in destination countries. I myself have done work on the impact of co-nationals when, for example, we have processes of state building, and some people that belong to one nation are not included within the boundaries, the modern boundaries of this nation. So we have had, for example, the example of Greek refugees from Turkey, or we have the example of Hungarian refugees after World War I again, when Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory with the Trianon Treaty, and many Hungarians followed the new borders of their country and left the lands of what is now Romania, Croatia, or Slovakia. But what about migrants that are not part of the destination group? Because one can say that, of course, it is easy to measure the political behavior if you're a co-national, because co-nationals get passports automatically. But the Poles in America or the Russians in America did not get passports automatically. So they cannot vote directly. So there is another strand of literature that basically discusses how the locals react when migrants come to their neighborhood, how their political preferences change when they go to the supermarket or to the local community club and they see suddenly migrants there. How does it change their own political beliefs and preferences? So Central and East European migrations to the US has been a topic that we chose exactly to contribute to this very big discussion. So we hypothesized that shocks in the country of origin, the Big Bang, we get this term from astronomy and also from transition theory, economic transition theory, can, through migrant communities, influence the political behavior in destination countries. I want also to say that we're in the beginning of this research project, and we are going to develop it more. We have some primary results that I want to share with you. So, what is the role of East European Americans? What is the role of ethnic identity in voting? Even in the recent American elections, this has been a very important subject. So Kamala Harris, the Democratic candidate, directly addressed the 800,000 Polish Americans in Pennsylvania, one of the US states that were decisive for the victory of Kamala Harris's opponent, Donald Trump. So Harris said that if Russia wins in Ukraine, Poland could be the next Kremlin target as a strategy to mobilize and sensitize the Polish Americans. Our paper shows that historical developments in Eastern Europe matter for the political economy of the United States, that no country can be insulated from developments in Eastern Europe. Why study the political impact of immigration? I have already given you a lot of excuses, a lot of motivations for it. So, immigration remains a key issue in elections, in the recent US election with Trump, but also in the UK with David Cameron and Brexit, but also in Europe with Giorgia Meloni in Italy and also the rise of AfD in Germany. So how many are these Polish Americans? In 2021, 8.8 million people self-identified as Polish Americans, which is 3% of the US population. There is evidence in the literature that a distinct Polish American vote still exists. So, what is the role? And of course, the other question that the literature has been exploring is what is the role of ethnic identity in voting? Does it matter if I'm a Pole, a Russian, a Greek, an Uzbek, when I'm in the US on what I will vote? For many Polish Americans, ethnicity may be symbolic and optional. Nevertheless, for others, it can be politically significant. Symbolic identity can become salient and shape voting behavior. And given their concentration in swing states, remember the wall was a term that was used for those states, Wisconsin, Michigan, next to the border with Canada. There are many Polish Americans there. Illinois, Chicago, my God, if you have been in Chicago, I'm sure you have heard Polish on the street. So Polish Americans continue to be a key electoral group. So for those groups, developments in their country of origin, in quotes, can shape political preferences. So what is the literature that we have from economics that motivated us to develop this project? So we have Tabellini and others that have written on the impact of historical migration on electoral outcomes. We have the relationship between immigration and redistribution. Redistribution, of course, as a strategy to combat inequality. We have the connection between specific ethnic migrant groups and socio-political outcomes. And, of course, the impact of political and economic events abroad, shocks on domestic electoral outcomes. So what is the history? So here we have, it was quite challenging to use this IPU MS data. So we are basically focusing on the first half of the 20th century. And you see here 3 curves. You see the curve of the US born. On the horizontal axis, you have the year. On the vertical axis, you have the raw number in millions. So you have the curve of US-born people, of foreign-born people, and the share of foreign-born people. What do we observe? We observe that in the first half of the 20th century, the actual numbers of foreign-born people in the US are stable, but we have a rise of US-born people and a decline of foreign-born people. Of the foreign-born share, And we see the intersection between the 2 curves, although, of course, we are talking about a share versus, so for the share, you must look on the right-hand side, because on the left-hand side, we have numbers, and on the right-hand side, we have percents. Exactly. So the intersection of these 2 curves is some years before 1920. So that way we get some sense of the data. So obviously, what we see from this curve is that really lots of mobility took place before the 1920s. So this is the sense that we get from this. So before the 1920, we have large Polish and Central European migration to the US. What happens in 1917? The US in 1917 does what? On the one hand, they enter World War I after leaving the Europeans 3 years killing each other. So, but on the other hand, what do? They pass the 1917 Immigration Act, which introduced literacy tests to limit arrivals from Central Europe. In the 1920s, things become a bit harder than that. So in 1921, we have the Emergency Quota Act that sets the first numerical limits on immigration. In 1924 Immigration Act, we have national origin quotas based on the 1890 census. So we have a lot of Poles. We don't want so many Poles. We may get some more from another ethnicity, another group. Severely limiting Polish and East European migration. And in the 1930s and 40s, as you know, under the Great Depression, America stopped being so attractive because of the crisis. And we have the 1948 Displaced Persons Act, which allowed Polish and East European refugees after World War II, also, of course, primarily Jewish. So let's focus on so we have here 4 curves, and the structure is again the same. Horizontal axis year, left vertical numbers, population size in millions, and right-hand side percents. So what do we observe? We have the Polish population in millions, the Russian population in millions, the Polish share of foreign-born and the Russian share of foreign-born. So what do we observe? I mean, the Russian population in millions stands out in the beginning of the 20th century. We don't separate at this point between the Jewish population and the Slavic population. It's also quite hard to do it to some extent. We see that the curves for the Russian population in millions and the Russian share of foreign-born follow more or less the same trend until 1930. And the same is the case for the Polish migrants. So how do they behave politically? Because, of course, Polish Americans, the Poles come to the US relatively earlier than the Russians. So how do they behave politically? Those of them that slowly get naturalized. What do they choose? So Polish Americans in 1916 supported Woodrow Wilson for advocating the Polish autonomy. Nevertheless, after World War I, the instability of the Polish Republic, of the Second Republic of Poland, had the opposite effect and made the Poles more to shift towards the Republican Party. The New Deal again changed its allegiances and provided economic relief, securing Polish-American support for Franklin Roosevelt. While the Polish-American Congress of 1944 advocated for Poland's independence, the fact that Poland became socialist and part of the larger imperium of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe dissatisfied Polish Americans, making them feeling betrayed, leading again to political shifts. So, what is the Polish-American vote now? So as of 2008, 36% identified as Democrats, 33% as independents, and 26% as Republicans. So it means that they appear to be a swing voter group, particularly in battleground states, which we explained before. So, and both major parties actively court, actively follow, and try to recruit Polish-American voters. And obviously, social issues, economic policy, but also foreign relations regarding Poland are very important for them. So what is the first conclusion here is that Polish Americans have been dynamic in their political alignments, and their voting behavior reflects a mix of ethnic identity, historical events, and contemporary policy concerns. So these are some pictures that signify the importance of the Polish-American vote throughout the 20th century in the US up to the early 21st century. So Polish-Americans with FDR, with John F. Kennedy, and also with Kerry, with John Kerry. So let us first start discussing our empirical strategy here. So what do we do in order to analyze this problem? So following Abramitsky, so Abramitsky is a scholar at Stanford University, we define, who actually wrote recently on a similar subject, thank God not on our subject. So he basically wrote a paper on Poland as well, on Poles in America, but not for politics, for labor market outcomes. So, and of course, he had to define also Polish residents. So Polish residents are people that were born in Poland or whose parents were born in Poland and identified in every 10-year census from 1900 to 1950. And of course, an exception is that Poland was not listed as a country of birth, we don't know yet why, in the 1910 census. And what were their occupational categories? What were they doing? when coming to the US. So white collar, farmers, unskilled and skilled. So this is our explanatory variable. So this is how we approach our explanatory variable. This is our outcome variable here. So the data that captures the outcomes we want to study. So we focus first on presidential election data. And we have rayon level or county level vote shares. Because, of course, in economics, we want to maximize our number of observations to have lots of statistical power in our results. And this includes the share of votes for the Democratic and the Republican parties. So to ensure geographic consistency, we use the 1950 administrative division of the US. So there is also a new method that was developed by some very nice colleagues of ours, Ferrara and Fischbach, that are able to standardize county boundaries using the county-to-county crosswalk, because sometimes the boundaries become bigger, become smaller, some counties merge. So they have developed a strategy that allows this partial merging to happen very quickly. And we also apply weights to adjust each census to the 1950 county borders as well. So you already see that the way to construct this data set has already been quite a challenge. It's not easy. So merging census with electoral data. So electoral data is merged with census data using population estimates, and population data for election years between census years is linearly interpolated. Okay, so we make some linear interpolations that is actually allowed. Also, so interpolation means that when I know the data point in period 1 and period 3, I can interpolate data for period 2. Okay, so this is quickly said the logic of linear interpolation. I can assume that if I know data in period 1 and period 3, I must know I can extend this data in the intermediate period. So what is the methodology? Because of course, when we're talking about these kinds of estimations, and we need to think about a very key word in economics that none of us likes, but we all take into account all the time when we write papers, called endogeneity. So then the chicken-egg problem, right? How do you know that the egg made the chicken or the chicken made the egg and vice versa? So how do you know? So, and exactly so, so here we propose our basic theory. So this is a basic panel regression. So, and we have what? We have M is the immigrant share, and X is our control variables, so including the share of the Polish population, the incumbency of Democrats in 1920, latitude and longitude, population density, and our outcome is the vote for the Democrats. Which, of course, because it's a presidential election, 1 minus that is the vote for the Republicans, so it is the same thing. So, and what is the idea we use first in order to deal with this chicken-egg problem, the endogeneity problem? Is, again, by the literature, the migration studies literature and the migration economics literature, this idea of the shift-share instrument. So those of you that have done some advanced econometrics have heard of the instrumental variables approach, I'm sure. So we're using an instrument basically to show, so an instrument is what? Is an exogenous variable that impacts the outcome variable only through the explanatory variable, and we know the exclusion, restriction, and all these things. So we use this shift-share instrument. What does this shift-share instrument means? That migrants go where other migrants of the same group have been. So if I am a Greek and I want to go to the US, I will go to Astoria. Why will I go to Astoria in Europe? Because this is where the Greeks usually used to go. Or if I'm Pole, I will go to the outskirts of Chicago. Why? Because this is where the Poles used to go in the US. So So instrumenting immigration flows using historical settlement patterns. Based on 1900 immigrant locations across US counties, and of course, interacting with 1920, 1950 country-specific inflows. So motivation is exactly what I have just told you. Immigrants tend to cluster geographically. They all go to the same place, or we assume that they do. The newcomers settle within existing ethnic, where existing ethnic communities are strong, and family ties and social networks, of course, drive settlement choices. All these statements say the same thing. So how does the instrument work? So the instrument predicts county-level immigrant inflows based on past settlement patterns. And we use 1900 distributions and interact them with later national level inflows. So, and we also, of course, test for pre-trends. And here you see the construction of the instrument. So basically, this is the explanatory variable, and this is how we use the shift-share instrument to construct it. So Card, the Nobel Prize winner, also professor at Berkeley, where I studied, the famous labor economist. So, and of course, we have recent applications of the shift-share IV by Maida and also by Tabellini. And you have a theoretical and practical summary in the Goldsmith-Pinkham text. I mean, we still need to work a bit more to test our validity, but we are convinced that it's worthwhile to start with it. Why and how does the instrument work? So the immigrants do exhibit geographic clustering, so we do observe this. And social networks and ethnic communities influence settlement decisions through family ties or community networks. So how did networks influence migration? Here we do also some historical research, qualitative research. So there are even letters that have been published in newspapers. So a Polish mother is writing to her son in America. So this is a publication from already 1927 saying that we received your letter. Now I write to you from our Vincentovo, the city in Poland, asking if you want to give, if you want me to give your address in America to these guys from our village, right? To come and find you or not. So this is a very characteristic historical example, and there are several, of course, of those. So where are the poles? So we have some initial mapping. So where are the poles? Do we have a dot here to? No? Okay. So where are the poles? So what is this area that we see over there? Huh? Yeah, the northeast, right? And also what? So where you don't see anything, it's no data, as you can see. But where are the darker colors? You see Michigan, you see Illinois, right? You see New York, and also north of New York. You see Pennsylvania. So the northeast and the wall, the Canadian border. So this is 1900. And this is 1950. The picture is even more consolidated here. As we can see. So this is the data set that we are talking about. Which state is over there? Yes, very good. And let's see the Russians. The Russians follow a slightly different pattern. Where are the Russians? Huh? So exactly they're not in the Midwest, they're more in what we call in the US the Central Plains. They're more to the west. We have also some Russians in Texas. So you already get the sense already from the empirical. So the Poles are more in democratic or quasi-democratic states. The Russians are everywhere, but stronger in the more Republican states. So, and this is, we have the Russian-born population by county here in 1950. Again, the picture, the map is somehow more consolidated. We also have California, we have San Francisco, but also Southern California. So what are the results that we have found? So another thought that we have been having here is to use weighted regression using the 1920 county population as weights, because of course this would mean that countries with a larger population will get more weight in the analysis. So, and of course, if the results differ between weighted and regular regressions, this may suggest a strong heterogeneity between high and low population counties. So this is only one of the ways to think about heterogeneity. As I said, we're still in the beginning of this project, and we will produce more results in that direction. So the results are, of course, preliminary. So what do we find? We find in the unweighted regressions a strong democratic effect for the Poles and a strong Republican effect for the Russians. So the Russians are, in the first panel, as you see, the unweighted regression, have a strong, so they're much more inclined to vote Republican, and the Poles much more inclined to vote Democratic. But when we use the weighted regressions, also the Russians appear to shift towards the Democratic camp. And so, and what are the baseline results here? That a higher Polish population share in a county is positively associated with the Democratic vote share in presidential elections between the 1920 and 1950. The result is robust even when using and weighted regressions. So for the Russian population, the results are more ambiguous. So on the one hand, because the relationship between total foreign-born and Russian populations with voting outcomes changes significantly when we apply weights. So it means that to explain the Russian political preferences in the US, we need to take into account heterogeneity. It means that there is high heterogeneity in settlement patterns requiring further analysis. And this further analysis can be what? What is their human capital? Are they doctors and lawyers or workers and craftsmen? How do the locals and the skills of the locals compare to the skills of the Russians in a given settlement? Are they more on the top of the society and the economy, or more in the lower half of the distribution? So where do they position themselves in terms of the local economy that they find work at? And of course, we will do all these tests. So, and of course, so we also want to see the effect of the ethnic composition on the democratic vote. So when, again, the dependent variable is the share of the democratic vote, and we have the share of the Polish population and the interaction between the Poles and high population counties, and the share of the Russian population, and then the interaction between Russian and high population. So in the Russian case, it is reversed. In the Polish case, it is robust. And of course, I think what is also very important is, so here we have the visualization the visualization of the weighted regression. So and you see how it progresses. So essentially what we see is that the magnitude of the democratic coefficient of the Poles becomes even higher as years continue. Whereas in the Russian case, we have a much stronger ambiguity. It goes up, and then it goes down, and then a bit up again. So also, this was our first. So these were our regular regressions. So now we implement the two-stage least square approach with the instrument. And this allows us to argue for some maybe causality. But again, as I said, we're in the beginning of this. And what do we find? We find actually a big F statistic. So we have evidence that maybe this is actually also causal. And the F statistic is much bigger when we discuss, when we test the poles again, the F statistic is quite big and significant in the, as we see in the third specification, for example, where we have also significant coefficients. So here we compare the results between OLS and two-stage least square, and it's basically, so the two-stage least square results corroborate, confirm to a large extent our primary results. And this is again the same for the Russians. So for the Russians, as I said, we do have, we have a negative effect in the OLS, a positive effect in the two-stage least square. And this, as you can see in the first panel, in the unweighted regressions, only a positive effect in the weighted regressions on the democratic vote. So more work needs to be done for the Russians. The Russians are harder to unravel than the Poles, as it seems in this project, so more work is needed in that sense. But we find significant results, which essentially makes us optimistic that we will decipher, we will derive even more the secrets of this behavior. So what are the key findings? For the Polish population, as the Germans say, we are eindeutig, so it's clear, right? So we have strong and positive, significant relationship with the democratic vote share. With the Russian and the total foreigners of the US, we have lower in magnitude, but still positively and significantly associated with the democratic voting, with an asterisk, the significant results for the Republican Party in the beginning of our regression analysis, which we will further explore. So, and these are the effects of the total foreign population. So, as we see here, the significance levels are lower compared to the Poles or the Russians, which again, in my view, makes a very important case for what we have defined in the beginning as East European big banks. So the specificity, the importance of Eastern Europe for American political development. So, and here we have, again, the effect of Polish share on the democratic vote and its progression. So it follows the same trend as the baseline estimates. And here we see the ambiguity of the Russian case even stronger. So it goes up, the magnitude, then down, and then up again. So what does the evolution of the IV estimate suggest? That the relationship between migrant population and voting outcomes is dynamic, so it changes over time. So the Polish population share was initially insignificant or even negative until 1936, and then so we have then positive and highly significant results in all relations thereafter. So, and the Russian population share becomes statistically significant from 1939 onwards. So what do we find here? So for me to wrap up this project, I think it should be quite clear by now what the research question and the research methodology has been, and I'm happy to get your comments, substantive, methodological, any comments you may want to suggest. So there is a strong proclivity of Polish Americans towards the Democratic Party. We have ambiguous political preferences, so more volatile political preferences of Russian Americans between the Democratic and the Republican Party. And I think the main argument of this paper is the mapping of East European critical junctures, of East European big banks on the American political economy. So, and of course, I mean, in terms of the methodology, we have been having different ideas, different thoughts. How many minutes do I have?
Like 15?
I have more 15 minutes.
You can do shorter.
Okay. So basically, what is the idea so what are the alternative approaches here that we may have? So we may actually extend the IV strategy following other parts in the literature. We may use railroad expansion as a way to understand the expansion of minorities, of foreign-born people, of Russian and Polish Americans from the east to the west, so to follow essentially the railroad network. And so to think more about heterogeneity, I mean, actually, this is, I think, for me, maybe the most important way to think about developing this model after these basic correlations and basic instrumental approaches that you have seen is to think about human capital as a mechanism between origin and political behavior, and voting preferences, political preferences. So, and also your relative standing as a migrant in the destination economy that you settle at. So, of course, the persistence in settlement patterns, so we may correlate the 1950 presence of Poles with contemporary Polish identification using the American Community Survey. So essentially to evaluate, of course, the strength of this identity, and also investigate the impact of historical migration on more recent electoral outcomes and political preferences. But as I said, the first priority in this project for me would be to dig more in the direction of heterogeneity, and also to think more about railroad expansion and the distribution of migrants. So, and this is Polish immigrants working on the farm in Maryland in 1909. So, and this is another picture of a Polish coal miner in Coppell, West Virginia in 1938. Yeah, and these are the occupational shares over time and by group. So, I mean, to give you a more in-depth description of our data. So we have farmers, skilled, unskilled, and white collar. So you see that when it comes to white collar, we have the Russians. It's pretty strong. And when it comes to skilled, I mean, the Poles and the Russians are comparable, and the Poles are much more unskilled than the Russians, but all the curves are moving downwards. So, of course, I mean, some other steps would be, of course, to think about organized labor. Were there any syndicates? Were there any institutions that organized Polish or Russian workers in America? Do we know anything about that? What was the role of churches and religious communities? Orthodox Church in America, Catholic Church in America, how did they play there? And of course, the different religious backgrounds. What about the Jews? Separate Polish Jews from non-Polish Jews, and the same for the Russians. So Abramitsky, he created the Jewish names index to distinguish Catholic from Jewish migrants from Poland. So thank you for your questions and your comments. I'm very happy to discuss. Thank you very much.